Okay, so what we talked about was the earliest encounters that you have with anthropology and linguistics. And you were saying that it was when you were an undergraduate at Bryn Mawr and in your contact with people like Frederica de Laguna and Nancy Dorian. So you want to talk about your first encounters with anthropology and linguistics?
Okay, yes, absolutely. I went to Bryn Mawr College, which, as you all know, is well, maybe you don't all know. Some of you may know as a snob school, a women's school. It was a women's school then. It was, as it turned out, not my favorite place to be, but it was good, and you could obtain a good education there. But I went with no idea of what I wanted to major in. Some of you probably knew, I didn't. So what I did was I took a bunch of required courses, and then I started taking quite a few different social science courses to see what would attract my attention. And in my sophomore year, I took an introduction to anthropology course that was taught by Frederica de Laguna, who was a student of Franz Boas's, who was the founder of American Anthropology. So that we were going right back to the last, I believe, of the, as we might say in idiomatic English, the horse's mouths, or the real McCoy. She, like Boas, worked in the Northwest, principally on the Northwest coast, but also with Eskimoan people. And she, like Boas, was a four fields kind of anthropologist. Anthropology was at the time split up into cultural anthropology, archaeology, biological anthropology, then known as physical anthropology, and linguistics. And she did them all to a certain extent. I think her real concentration was on cultural anthropology, including both archaeology and contemporary cultural anthropology. But she did a little bit of everything. And she was what you would have called back then also a kind of a dry, a little bit acerbic old maid. We no longer talk in those terms, thank God, but that's what she was, except that when she started talking about the quacudal, for instance, she put on a potlatch in class, and she was able to act out texts and drama, and she did so. And she didn't seem dried or particularly old at all when she would do those things. So her own personality and the content of the material drew me very rapidly toward anthropology. I met, a number of other students, and one of them said to me at the end of our sophomore year, these big classes, by the way, were year-long classes. They weren't just one semester always. So I had a whole year of anthropology in my sophomore year. And this, as I recall, I may be wrong, but I think I did. And this person said to me, guess what? A linguist is coming to Bryn Mawr. We didn't have a linguistics department or even a single linguist. And she's going to study linguistics. And I said, what's that? I mean, you can figure it out a little bit from what the name is, but I didn't really know what the content of that was. So this student, who was obviously quite a bit more savvy than I was, told me what it was. And I thought to myself, I'm not very good at languages. I don't really think that would be a good course for me, but if, my friends are taking it, I should take it too. So I did. And who was the linguist who was coming to campus? Nancy Dorian. Nancy Dorian was the first linguist to look in depth at language death and language shift. And she did so by working with Scots Gaelic and the fact that Scots Gaelic was being abandoned in favor of Scottish English at a very fast rate in Scotland. And so she wrote a number of books about, one called, I think, Language Death, another one called The Fisher Folk of Somewhere, Wherever. And she was hired at Bryn Mawr into the German department where she had to teach German, poor thing. But she, her research was on language shift and language death. And I found her to be an absolutely fascinating and very nice person and teacher. And she taught a field methods course, and that really got me going. Just actually hearing data from another language and paying attention to it. And the language she used was Gujarati, which is an Indo-Aryan language, fairly, in the family with the subfamily with Hindi and all of those languages. And I remember my first, jaw-dropping moment when we asked for the word for foot. Well, what the informant said was bug. And so we all said, well, is that anything like bug in English? And she said, no, not at all. Bug. The first sound is completely different from bug. So it was the first time that I ever noticed the difference between a voiceless, unaspirated stop and a voiced stop. And it was just, mind blowing. My jaw was dropping. What? And from then on, it was just so much fun. That was the first course that I ever took that I was willing to stay up late to study instead of fool around. And I'd sit in a chair looking at word lists and trying to figure it all out, getting into the distribution of the sounds and the allophones and all of that. And so I loved it. And I ended up being an anthropology major as an undergraduate, having been blessed with actually 3 of the most wonderful teachers in that field in the world. Besides Frederica de Laguna and Nancy Dorian, we had another person named Jane Goodale, A-L-E, not the chimpanzee lady, on the staff. And she was trained in the Malinowski tradition. So that was completely different from Freddie de Laguna. And Jane worked in Australia first and then in Papua New Guinea. So she also worked in a completely different part of the world. And she was a great storyteller. She was one of those people who would sit up at the front of the room and just tell stories the whole time about her field work and about what it was like. And I decided from listening to her that field work sounded really cool, but not in Papua New Guinea, thank you. And it just sounded too far, too alien, too difficult. So that was my undergraduate tradition. And obviously there was a complete overlap and conjunction of both linguistics in the form of Nancy Dorian and anthropology in the forms of Freddie de Laguna and Jane Goodale. I also went on a dig sponsored by the University of Oklahoma at Norman, and that was a lot of fun. But I came back to college and then took an archaeology course and decided it was very boring in the theoretical aspects. So I eliminated archaeology as one of the things I kind of like to do the work, but I didn't want to read site reports and things like that. And so I duly graduated and with a major in anthropology and not very good grades. And De Laguna was sort of, if you want to go to graduate school, I don't really know where you're going to get in. And so I waited around a while and got married and went off to the Charlottesville, where my husband was studying for his PhD in mathematics at the University of Virginia. And so then my choices of where to go were constrained by where he might get a job. And so he got a job at the University of Florida. His job searching was also a little constrained by the necessity of finding a place that had an anthropology department. And so he got an offer at the University of Florida, and I said, take it. And we did, and I went there. And the University of Florida was, of course, a very different kind of school from that I had gone to before. It was a state school. It was a good school. I think state schools in general are a lot better than little privates, frankly. They have a lot more variety. And big privates are a different thing, but little privates are very, and to my mind, very constrained, very constrictive also. So there were a lot of graduate students instead of one or two. And my first year at the University of Florida, I was sort of drifting around and not liking it very much. And then a linguist came to the Anthropology department at Florida. So it wasn't even just a linguist came to campus, but one came to the department. And her name was Martha Hardman de Bautista, and she had worked principally in Peru. She worked on Aymara and Hakkaru, and she married a man who was Hakkaru speaking. And she was dynamic and fascinating and, nuts also, I have to say. She was a bit crazy. But that's when I figured out I was doing the right thing, that what I needed to do was linguistics. It wasn't just anthropology in a general way that appealed to me, it was linguistics. And when Florida didn't have a linguist, it was, ho-hum, and I drifted. When it got a linguist, then I had a path. And so I worked on Aymara for my master's and wrote a thesis on verb derivation in Aymara. And when I was a number of years ago, when we had a class that included, as a first-year student, Adam Tallman, who some of you know about, he asked me at some point in the class, well, do you still agree with everything you said in your master's thesis about Aymara? And I said, Adam, I haven't read that in like 35 years. I have no idea whether I agree with it or not. And I don't know what I said. I don't know what the studies on Aymara what studies have taken place. And so no, I can't answer your question, and I'm not going to do the work to be able to answer your question either, was the subtext there. Anyway, so at this point then I had finally put together that I did want to do linguistics and I wanted to do it within anthropology, and that I don't think I could articulate it at the time, but what I think was at play there was that my mind works better looking at data and not looking at simply theory. And what I was good at was acquiring data and analyzing data and putting it to some of the tests that you need to put it to see if it fits with theory and all of that sort of thing. But it was coming from the data end, not coming from the theoretical end. And that's it. Just, we all have different kinds of minds, and that's the way mine worked. What I didn't probably know yet was where I was going to go with it. But I got my chance after I'd finished my master's, which I took a little bit of extra time on. So every time I give any of you any kind of grief about taking too long on your projects, just remind me that I took a little too long on my master's degree, and maybe I will calm down, okay? It's not that you shouldn't be timely, but that we aren't always timely. So I took 3 years to finish just a master's. And in that third year, there were an announcement that came across the desk asking for linguists to go and work in Guatemala. And I looked at that announcement and it looked awfully interesting. But then I said, well, I can't do that. I don't speak Spanish. I have a husband who doesn't have anything to do in Guatemala. I don't know anything about Guatemala. It scared the pants off me. It just doesn't seem like a good thing. So I threw it away. And then the same announcement came again. And I looked at it a little more deeply and I said, well, why couldn't I do that? And I began to look into it. And what they wanted was some linguists to work in Guatemala, to work with a newly being founded kind of NGO that was being, as I found out subsequently, sort of decommissioned from having been a place that served priests, provided them with informants so they could learn local languages. And there was some crazy gringo who was taking it over and turning it to research. And it just began to look like maybe something I could do. It was going to be subsidized by Peace Corps. So the linguists they found would get a wage, and would be taught Spanish and would be, you know, have medical care and be overseen. Now, the wage, I might tell you, was $25 a week. Now, of course, dollars were worth more than blah, 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 but that's pretty small wage. And, but it worked. And so eventually I applied and was accepted. There were only 2 people in that entering group, me and a neo-grammarian historical linguist named Will Norman, who was very good, but ultimately quit doing linguistics and went into AI, something he could sit at a desk to do, I guess. And so I ended up going down to Guatemala, being taught Spanish in an intensive class. If any of you need to learn a language, it's the only way to go. I always thought I was an absolutely horrible language learner. I couldn't learn a language at all. I never took even 1 minute of formal Spanish in school. You know, when I went to high school, you had to take Latin because you were a smart kid and like that. So I never took Spanish. And I learned Spanish very well. Ultimately, it took me years to get it up to speed. But in that first intensive course I took, I did 2 months. And those 2 months enabled me to then build on it in daily life, using it and eventually changing it from Campesino Spanish to academic Spanish, at least when needed. I can still kind of do Campesino Spanish too, however. So I dominate several different registers in Spanish. And those of you who have heard me speak know that it's not by any means perfect. My pronunciation is not native, and my grammar is not nearly as good as Lizzie's, but my Spanish is quite fluent. And I can do everything I need to do, including giving formal speeches in Spanish when I have to. The first few times I ever had to do that was very scary, but I managed. So then I went down to this thing, and the idea that they had, Terry Kaufman was the linguist in charge. And the idea he had with this crazy gringo, I say crazy, partly in seriously and partly in fun, was to convert this thing that was, you know, providing informants for priests to a research center where the so-called informants then would become researchers and would work on their own languages. And Martha Hardman had been a real pioneer in that kind of work, not to convert informants into researchers, but to work with native speakers of Aymara in particular to do their own work on their own languages. Those of you who are from Bolivia know that Juan de Dios Yapita became quite well known as a linguist. And the other person she worked with for many years, Juana Vasquez, was at least known locally also as somebody who knew a great deal about her own language. And they wrote things. They wrote things with her. They wrote other kinds of materials. And so now Kaufman had kind of the same idea. He was egged on by Ken Hale, who, if you haven't heard of, you should find out who he is. Kenneth Hale was at MIT, and he was also the major pioneer of working with native speakers of indigenous languages of the world to develop materials about linguistics and educational materials in their own languages and for their own purposes. He's from Arizona, and he worked with many Arizona languages at the University of Arizona principally, and some at MIT. Some people, he got up to MIT and got them PhDs there. He also worked in Australia and a number of other places in the northern indigenous languages in the US and around. He is very unfortunately dead. He died a little early in my estimation. He was without doubt the greatest contributor to this field we have ever seen, the field of working with speakers of languages to do their own linguistics. And he is the author and author and editor of a very well-known series of papers that came out in Language in 1992 in which Michael Krauss, another well-known person in the field of language death, wrote about language death, and in which Ken wrote about the the things we can find out by working on unusual or understudied languages, and which other people, including several speakers of various languages, like a speaker of Hopi and I don't remember the others in particular exactly, wrote articles about working in different situations. I wrote an article there too, for which I am always grateful to Ken for having invited me to write for that particular group. Ken was the main moving light in this whole thing of teaching speakers to do their own analysis. And Martha, totally independently of Ken, had taken it up herself for Aymara, and Terry Kaufman, not independently of Ken, had taken it up for Maya. So I was hired as one of these two linguists. I was hired to work on two vastly different dialects of the language MAM, M-A-M, and to teach speakers of that language about their own language and about how to analyze it. And the first project that Terry was interested in, I want to make you guess, he is basically a historical linguist. So what is the first thing he wanted people to work on? Come on, somebody.
Word lists.
Huh?
Word lists.
Word lists. Lee, what were you going to say?
The divergence of the two dialects.
Yeah, but to do that, you need what Danny has, word lists. So the first thing was lexical material, for which we started with the Swadesh list. And then we moved on to a 650 word list that Kaufman had made up for Mesoamerica. It's a very good list. So he was getting into it, a lot of the local cultigens and animals and so on. So it was a list that was devoted to the area specifically. He didn't much care about us getting any grammar or teaching any grammar, but he really cared about the lexical stuff. So we did that. And everybody who worked on that project produced a dictionary. They were modest dictionaries, 6,000 words about, most of them. Some of them are under, but the big ones were about 6,000 words. And that's modest. I went on a rant about this the other day, I believe, about how to write a good dictionary, you should be heading for 10,000 and up, 20,000 around there. But these were 6,000 word dictionaries, which are the basics. What it means is every time I need to look up a word in MAM, it's not in the dictionary, because the words that are in the dictionary I already know, right? So, but it's good if you're starting back at a level of MAM that's not, that you don't know as much as I do. And maybe there's a couple of words I've looked up that I've actually found there, but mostly I don't. And in the process, we taught, phonetics, phonology, morphology, and syntax to the students. Now, I have to say that Terry Kaufman, who was and is a very, very smart guy and really knows a lot of historical linguists, although Danny will tell you, not everybody agrees with everything he has to say. He's the kind of teacher that teaches the clouds. So he would do a lecture. Not a single person in that class would understand it except me and Will, who would usually understand it, maybe not always. And so then we would do the typical TA function of translating our teacher to the students. So we'd have separate meetings with the students and teach them everything that they didn't understand when Terry taught it. Terry would come down at that time 2 months out of the year and give his short courses. So we'd have a month in January and a month in the summer. And then Will and I would spend the rest of the year explaining things all over again and having the kids actually, I say kids because most of them were pretty young. The guys I worked with were like 21. We would have them then start making the database for the dictionary. This was making a database and taking notes and collecting material before we had any personal computers. You have to understand that even though I'm in your world to a certain extent, I started off pen and ink on pieces of paper, and that lasted until the 80s. So this was in the early 1970s that we started working on this project. It was like 1971 that the project started. And so I was working purely pen and ink until 85. So that's 14 years of no machinery, except that we hired a computer programmer to put the results of the dictionary on a mainframe computer that was housed probably in a bank in Guatemala City. And so we were able to produce the dictionaries to go to press in a computerized form, but one which I'm not too sure was all that useful because it it wasn't as flexible as these forms are now. It was kind of, what was put in was what stayed, and it was almost as bad to revise as it would be to go over a typed manuscript and revise that. But anyway, I didn't have to do the revisions, so I don't care. So in this process, then I got to begin to work with speakers of the language right away. And the first thing was, I was still learning Spanish. I got to tell you that working on word lists when you're still in the process of learning a language is great. I learned so much vocabulary. I had a much bigger vocabulary than most other people who were learning Spanish down there. I mean, I knew every plant and animal in Guatemala long before I could speak grammatically. But I noticed this very curious phenomenon, which I may have talked about before in here, I don't know, but I'll tell it again because we can't remember, which was that I would be sitting on one side of the desk with my Swadesh list, and then later my 650 word list and so on, and asking questions and writing them down. And I was working with two men from San Ildefonso, Ixtehuacan, and two others from San Juan, Ostuncalco. But it was the guys from Ixtehuacan who really started picking up on what the objective was, and they got interested in it. And they were two young men of, one was 20, one was 21. As I recall, they were both named Juan. I eventually worked with a third person from Ixtehuacan who was named Juan. This is a northern variety spoken in Huehuetenango, which is on the border with Mexico. And so as I was writing stuff down, I noticed that they were copying it. They were looking at what I was writing upside down, and they were putting it down and translating it to right side up on their pieces of paper. And that went on for a few days, and it occurred to me that something was going on there. And so I talked to them about that, and they said, well, they wanted to know how to write. And so they thought that if they copied what I wrote, that would work. They knew how to write in Spanish. They had sixth grade education, both of them, which is about all you could get if you were a Maya back then. And so I stopped eliciting, and I started teaching them to read and write in Mam. And they were smart, and they picked that up right fast, as we might say in Texas. And they were able to read and write very quickly, and they got all the hard stuff too. They were able to write long vowels, for instance, and glottal stops, which are the biggest problem areas in Mayan languages. And from then on, they were just sailing. They could just write down all their own stuff, and anything I asked, if they were interested in it, they'd start writing it. And sometimes they would go home and write things and collect their own data and so on. So that was my introduction to learning to pay attention to what speakers wanted and not just what my task was. And what I think I discovered at that time was that what speakers wanted was to be able to take some control of their own languages through the written form, through the spoken form, through the analysis. And they kept up with me the entire time. Now, in that particular, with those two guys, we got to the production of dictionaries, which is it really is a major production. And I think they, through that, understood very, very well the grammar of word derivation and the grammar of inflection and all of the other kinds of morphological aspects of the language. They understood some syntax, but we didn't get into it as much. It wasn't Terry's interest, and it doesn't come as naturally out of word lists. You really need texts. I had been taught by Martha Hardman to get a text immediately when I started doing fieldwork. Her rule was do the Swadesh 100 word list and then get a text. And so that's what I did. And I've carried that on ever since. Any language I work on that I don't know, I do the Swadesh 100 word list or some small word list, and then I get a text and start working on the text. And so we did work on text, but I didn't go as far in the in terms of the syntax. Okay, are there any questions right now before we go on? I mean, I'd be happy to just go on, but if you have anything that you've been wondering about, please let me know.
I have a question. When you were working in Guatemala training native speakers, what were the common challenges in training native speakers?
Well,
From both sides, like from you as a linguist and expert, and also native speakers who they know about their language, but they are not aware of linguistic features.
right. Well, obviously, there's one challenge right away, which is financial, right? The guy who, the person I referred to at the beginning as a kind of crazy guy who started this institution, he was a good fundraiser and he managed to get funding for these kids. I'm sorry, for these people. They were all men, by the way, at that time. In the 70s, nobody would let the women participate. That changed over time. That's crucial. People have to have enough money to live on if they're going to be in a situation where they're learning new things and applying them and all. And they didn't, it wasn't much. It was billed as a scholarship, but basically it kept them alive and it gave them a little actual cash to take back to their families. These people were all 100% campesinos, which means literally peasants, but it means subsistence farmers who lived in the rural areas and lived in a largely non-cash society. They didn't do work for wages. They did farm labor. And occasionally they would find a way to make a little actual money. And that was very important very often to the community to have a little bit of money coming in. And by a little bit, I mean a very little bit. People in these communities would typically work on the plantations in the harvest season to make a little cash if they needed it. So the fact that these men were bringing home, what was left out of $25 after they paid for their room and board when they were in Antigua was, which is where the classes were held, was significant. All right, so that's the first thing. That's the first challenge, is finding the money. You can't do this kind of project on nothing. But I gotta say, we did it on next to nothing. And it was not an expensive project to run. The gringos involved were living on very little for gringos, and the Guatemalans who were involved were living on very little as well. So then the other challenges were, of course, finding people. How do you go out into the wilderness and find somebody who's going to be interested in language rather than something else? And Terry developed a method which seemed pretty good, and it's served me up to the last project I ever had, which was in the 2000s. So it was 2003 to 2006, was to find some likely candidates, people who said they were interested, and then to give them an introductory short course in which they had to learn some stuff and produce results. So you would give them maybe 2 weeks of teaching them things about the language and test them on it. And the ones who would have enough interest to learn anything and enough ability to learn anything would stand out. It was, they stood out instantly. And by and large, we did pretty well on that system. But it means you don't go and just hire, your nephew or the guy next door, daughter-in-law, or somebody you met when you were a little kid. We usually had people going out to look for guys who were also parts of these communities. It wasn't us going in, it was other Mayas. And but we tried real hard to keep away from the, my neighbor would be a great person, and just test them and see if they were any good at this kind of work rather than some other kind of work that you could imagine for them. And we found some who were brilliant, and some who were good, and some who were mediocre. But just so long as you get a few of the ones who are at the top of the scale or the middle of the scale up, you're doing very well. And we kept that going every time we looked for people, and it worked very well.
Could you please I'm sorry for,
Sure, go ahead.
could you please elaborate a little bit more on what that test looked like?
It looked like,
Mhm.
it looked like kind of like the tests you give in intro.
Okay,
You're
thank
teaching
you.
introduction to linguistics, you know, test people on the sound chart and the morphological analysis. And that's exactly what those kinds of tests look like, because we needed people who could do linguistic analysis. So the best way to find out if they could would be to have them analyze things. The very first thing we would teach them would be to read and write. So the first test would always be a literacy test after they finished that part of the short course. And then we'd go on to the topics that you would see in intro. So those are two things. You got to get some money, you got to teach people, you got to pick people. And I think it worked pretty well. There may be lots of other ways to pick people, but this worked. The composition of the group changed over time. In that first group in 1971, only 2 people had gone beyond 6th grade. One of them had 9th grade education and the other one had graduated from high school. In the next group, the next 2 groups, I'm not sure of their composition very well because I didn't work with them. But then the next group that I worked with was in 88, 89, there were 2 groups. And first of all, there were 1, 2, 4, 5, 6 women in those groups, or maybe more, 6 to 9 women. So we actually started getting women. And they were, all of them except one, high school graduates. And then in 1997, we worked with 45 people. About half of them were women, 40% maybe. And they had all but one graduated from high school. And then in 2003 to 2006, we were working with very small languages, and we couldn't find people who were quite as qualified in the academic way, so that they weren't all high school graduates, because they were coming from places where there were no more than 1,000 speakers of the languages, and so you know, your selection is more limited when there's a small number of speakers. But most of them had some education. So the educational attainments of these people were going up, and the ability to find people with appropriate educational attainments was going up. At first, I think a lot of the gringos who worked on the project thought it might be advantageous to have people who didn't have very much formal education. Besides the fact that we couldn't find them, they thought, well, maybe they wouldn't have had their minds contaminated by bad Spanish education, which is mostly what you got in the rural areas back then. But I think in retrospect, I don't agree with that, because a fairly decent ability to read and write and to do arithmetic and to do a few of the other things you actually do learn in formal education turns out to be sort of central to any of these kinds of projects. So you just have to unteach some of the bad stuff and teach people to think things through logically again, and not just rely on some kind of naive intelligence to do that job. So I'm more for getting people with some level of education in Spanish and then convincing them to forget some of it. I guess I should mention the gringos. You got to find some gringos who are willing to do this too, right? Gringos or other people from outside the community. There were at the time no linguists in Guatemala. So it was absolutely a matter of going to outsiders. Today there are, and I'm very happy to say, by the way, that of all of these training programs and things we have done, a great many of these people are working in educational or investigatory roles in the communities and in their country, or some of them not in their country, but in Mexico, which has more money to pay people than Guatemala does. So we have, from the people that I've worked with, we have graduated a number of people with doctorates. Among them were, of course, first and foremost, Bala Mateo, then Luin Mateo, who was at Toronto, Balam is at CSS in Mexico. Telma Khan, who is at UNAM, their project known as SIMSUR in Mexico. Juan Jesus Vasquez, who's a Mexican, was never worked on my projects, but he worked with me and other people here. And he's a speaker of Chol, and he works at also SIMSUR, the southern branch of UNAM with Telma in Mexico. And Jose Reginaldo Perez Vail, and he's a mom speaker, and he worked with me very closely and wrote a great master's thesis at CSS. And Wai Khan, who is from Palin, he's a speaker of Pocomam, and he got a master's at CSS. So we have, and he's in Guatemala, and Chepe is in Guatemala. So we have, and then there's Romelia Mo, who has a master's from the University of Bonn, and she's in the Ministerio de Educación. So we have people who are working directly in education, both through universities, some in mostly foreign, like Mexico, the US, and Canada, and then other people who are working in Ministerio de Educación. And from the early years, we had a lot of people who were working as teachers also. So I would say that a lot of these folks are reproducing themselves, which is wonderful. And some of them have community projects of their very own. I mean, I know that Balam and Luin work together. They're both Anhobal speakers. They have a bunch of community projects. Telma has a community project. And Romelia goes all around the country teaching glyph writing to people. And because as you know, the Mayas had their pre-Columbian writing system, and she's got very interested in that, which is why she went to the University of Bonn and she teaches it. And people are fascinated by being able to write in glyphs. And another PhD that we have is Carmelina Espansay Serech, who got her degree at Vanderbilt in anthropology and is the vice minister currently of education, of bilingual education. So we've done pretty well in terms of placing people. And okay, we've worked with over 100 people, but we've placed a lot of these people have continued, and some of them, maybe I don't know what they do and I don't know their positions, but I bet they've continued too in some small ways to make contributions to their communities and to the education of their fellow townsmen. So, which is really exciting when you see people reproducing something from a project in their own way. I mean, then they're really making their own decisions. Now, I have to tell you something to end up today that I think is the most important thing about this kind of project. Speakers of indigenous languages, to my mind, will never have control of their languages if they leave some aspect of those languages always to foreigners. So if they say, the analysis of the languages, that's too hard, let the gringos do it, that they'll never have complete control of their languages. You don't need a ton of people with PhDs, but you need one, you need two, you need a couple of people who, when the foreigners roll into town and say, okay, the language is an ergative absolutive language, and we're going to treat the grammar this way in the textbooks, and we're going to screw it up because it's easier. And these people aren't too smart, and we should make it easier. So we'll call it a nominative language, and we won't use that terminology anyway. We'll just treat it like that, and then people will understand better. Well, of course, that's not true. But in spite of the fact that the foreigners might be wrong, they're being, or they have the possibility of being completely disdainful of the intellectual abilities of the people they're talking about or talking with. And that's not right. That won't help. People have to be able to do their own work. And so you have to train a few people. Or if nobody, I mean, I don't believe to going back to community roots and having people reinvent linguistics all by themselves. It takes too much time. So I think it's okay to learn some outside linguistics and then to figure out which parts of it don't work for you and check them out, and figure out which parts do work for you and use them. But you have to be able to have that in the community Otherwise, you're not independent and you won't be making your own decisions. And some of the decisions that other people make are going to be just dead wrong. Some of the decisions that you make were going to be dead wrong too, but you'll have your own community members to talk to about them and to try to, make them be right. And that's quite different from just always going back, well, we have to ask the boss, we have to ask the boss, we have to ask the outsider. I think that's the most important thing, that those of us who are true outsiders, we don't speak the language, we don't come from the community, and those of you who are getting the outside education but are not outsiders have to work on. It's making sure that people in the community become the leaders of any part of this whole enterprise of language, of strengthening the languages through the use of linguistics, linguistic knowledge, and materials that you can produce once you have those. So that's I think my last word for today, unless you have some other comments or questions.
I think we should probably cut it at this point but we can pick up with this theme next time. And I just thank you, Nora, for really wonderful and spirited, just especially that part at the end. I've never heard you say that before, and I thought it was just really, really great.
Well, it's something that's been either in the back or the forefront of my mind for years and years now, that the whole point of this is to not keep people dependent on you. It's to do exactly the opposite. Okay, thanks,
Okay,
everybody.
folks.